Hey everyone, what's up? Welcome back to another video, and today we're doing more content on eGPUs because I loves me an eGPU, as you probably have realized from the last video I did. And there's some new software that's just come out called Kryptonite, so we're going to check it out in this video and show you how it's, better, and that you should probably pay attention to it if you're in the market for an eGPU. And use Macintosh laptops, maybe Mac Minis and also iMacs as well. Let's check it out.
First up, a little introduction into Kryptonite. It's hosted on GitHub. It's a free and open source license project, which is pretty cool. I will have a link to this in the description, so don't freak out if I'm going through this really quick. And you can come back and read the features and the instructions at your leisure. These are the instructions I'll be taking you through really quick to get this set up. Otherwise, you can skip ahead to the good stuff where I talk about performance if you don't want to watch how to get this thing installed, but we're going to get along with that right now. I just briefly want to mention I have been using purge-wrangler before I tried using Kryptonite. Now, purge-wrangler worked really well. It has a couple of drawbacks though compared to Kryptonite. You have to turn off more security features, and it also changes your operating system on disk, so it installs some stuff into your OS. Whereas Kryptonite is a bootloader, or EFI. You can read more about that on this Wikipedia page, also in the description below, linked for you. Which means it doesn't change the OS on disk, and you can bypass it completely. Okay, right, now I'm going to walk you through the process of installing Kryptonite. First thing, if you have a Mac with a T2 security chip, you're going to have to turn that off. I've left some instructions linked in the description below, so you can go follow that. I don't have a T2 chip, so I can't really demonstrate it to you. Sorry about that. But what I will do is show you the rest of the instructions, because I can actually demonstrate that in full. So the next thing after turning off any T2 security chip, if you have one, for me, I've had purge-wrangler for a while, so I have to uninstall it. So it's very simple. I just run the script and then use Option 4 to uninstall it. In fact, when I run the script now, it's actually telling me that Kryptonite is the successor, so I should be using it. And yeah, you won't regret it. It's much better. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn back on the stuff I had to turn off to use purge-wrangler. So this is the good bit. I get to turn on a few extra security things, which I had to turn off. So I'm going to turn back on system integrity protection. Again, here are the instructions, but I'm just going to demonstrate it real quick to you now. So we're going to restart the Macintosh. I'm going to hold down Command and R while it's restarting. And by the way, this does take quite a while. You've got to be patient. Getting into recovery mode is not a quick thing, at least not on my Macintosh. Maybe yours is better than mine. Who knows? In all likelihood it is. This is 7 years old now. It was bought in 2015, so it's a little bit old. But once we get into recovery mode, it's going to look like this. We're going to go up and choose the utilities menu, open a terminal window, and then we're going to type CSRUtil enable. That's it. Now you can slow all that down and rewatch it at your leisure, but I want to get to the good stuff, so we're going to move ahead pretty quick. Then we're just going to reboot the Macintosh, and then it's going to come back awake with system integrity protection switch back on, and then we can get on with the next part, which is actually getting Kryptonite installed and then having a bit of a play with that and seeing how it goes. So that's the next thing we're going to do. And that's great timing. Computer's just booted back into the operating system, so now I can look at the next step. So the next step is creating a partition. Now we'll need to create this partition on the disk where the operating system is actually installed. And here are the details. So I'm going to call my partition Kryptonite. That just helps me find it a lot easier later in the installation. The format needs to be MS-DOS FAT, and the size is recommended to be 100 megabytes. I mean, I don't think it matters much if you go a little bit over, but yeah, just 100 megabytes is what they ask for. So I'm just going to type that in. At least I would try to type it in. You'll actually notice when I select MS-DOS FAT from that list, the size field, for some reason, you can't type it anymore. I guess this is another example of Apple thinking differently, but just not in a good way. The only way I can change the size now is to use this pie chart, which has very, very large jumps in megabytes when you move it. So you're just going to have to sort of like aim for 100 or thereabouts and then press go, apply, whatever, and move on, because it's not worth stressing about. So I'm just going to create that partition and then show you what happens after that. So it's not a very long process. This is about sort of 10 times speed playback. You'll see this screen. It'll stop any screen capture that you're doing. So if you're recording the screen for any purposes whatsoever, be prepared for that to just completely die, because it's going to have control over the disk, and apparently that means stopping anything writing to it. But never mind, we're on to the next step now, which is actually installing Kryptonite. So we're getting there. Now the best way is just to copy this command by doing what I just did. And you paste it into a terminal, and then it'll ask you for a password, which is your user password for your Mac. And then it's going to ask you some questions. First thing, if you know what OpenCore is, you can probably answer this question either yes or no according to what you want to do. If you've not heard of OpenCore, just press no. Next thing is debug resources. I pressed no because I didn't want to do any debugging, I just wanted to use it. And then finally, I'm using an AMD GPU, so I pressed no to that as well. Finally, before you commit to anything, it's going to give you a nice little summary. So if you've got anything kind of not quite right or you weren't quite sure, you get to read it again. And then the next step is selecting the disk that you partitioned. And this is why I named it Kryptonite, so it was easy to spot. Obviously, I don't have any other MS-DOS FAT partitions, so it was kind of obvious anyway. But in case you do have more than one partition, it's good to name it just so you can pick it out real easy in that list. And that's it, it's installed. It really doesn't take much time at all. And now we can go on to the final step. So what we have to do now is actually reboot the computer and then choose which bootloader to use. Because what we've actually done is installed another way to boot the Macintosh OS. And this is the cool thing about Kryptonite. You can actually choose to boot your OS using the original bootloader, which will give you your original Macintosh without any Kryptonite stuff loaded. So again, like I said earlier in the video, Kryptonite doesn't change the operating system on disk, it changes it as it's loading. So you can either choose to use the Kryptonite stuff and modify the OS as it's loaded into memory, which is really cool, or you can choose to use the original bootloader. And just in case you're wondering, in this list, well, it's kind of obvious again. On the left, we've got the original MHz bootloader. On the right, we've got the Kryptonite one. So obviously, if you want to use the Kryptonite one, you're just going to go with the one on the right. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to just move over to the right, choose that option, and then when you're in this menu, you just choose the option actually on the left, which is what will boot the OS back up. And now, if everything's working properly, you just take your cable to your eGPU and just plug it straight into one of the Thunderbolt ports. And so I did that, and then literally you're just looking for a little icon to appear in the menu bar at the top of the screen. It looks like a little microchip. There it is. It just popped into view. And then if you've got an external monitor as well plugged in, what's going to happen is these displays are basically going to resize, so they may go blank a couple of times. Don't worry, your computer hasn't died. Essentially, the computer's just like figuring out how to display everything on the multi-display setup. So you'll see, yeah, my screen goes black a few times, but then eventually the monitor at the back there, which is plugged directly into the eGPU, fires up with a second desktop. So that's kind of the first test, and we've got the eGPU up and running. Then I open Blender and you can see that it's recognized the eGPU, which is great. I'm using ProRender again, by the way, just in case you're wondering what this interface is, because it's not cycles, obviously. And also opened Activity Monitor and confirmed that the eGPU is actually accelerating Blender, so that's good. And that just basically means that it's drawing the user interface and rendering the 3D viewport on the graphics card, which is awesome. It makes it just way faster, so that's a really good thing. But obviously, you know, I didn't come here to like accelerate the viewport. I came here to see if I can use this chungus of a graphics card to speed up rendering, because that's really what I want to do. Rendering on a laptop sucks. If I can push that to the GPU, I'll be much happier. So naturally, I turned to the Mike Pan BMW scene and get that loaded up and see if I can just get it to render. I'm going to play with a few settings, obviously change to the render engine that actually works, because Cycles doesn't see the graphics card. Explanation in a previous video about why that happens on Mac systems. Everything looks pretty cool. Just mucking around with the settings and then decide, okay, let's give this a render. And to begin with, everything looks good. And this is where things got a little bit sideways and a little bit sort of, oh, maybe this isn't the right thing that I've done here installing Kryptonite, because it got to the point where it said it was drawing samples, but then it just stopped. And then it didn't go any further. And so, you know, I started sort of investigating to find out, well, okay, what's gone on? And I had to quit Blender several times and restart it. And every time I started the render, this MTL compiler service process would start up and start using a lot of CPU. And I actually looked up what this thing is, and essentially it's something that allows applications to use the graphics hardware. So it made a lot of sense that it was here, but this did not happen with purge-wrangler. So obviously my brain is going, what's going on? Why is this different? Well, it turns out if you just leave the MTL compiler service and Blender to run and do their thing for a while, eventually, ta-da, it will just start rendering. once the MTL compiler service finishes, then it's pretty much done until the next time you update ProRender or a driver updates, and then you can just render normally and not have to wait for this thing to do its thing. So how long are you going to be waiting? Well, I had to redo it again because I updated ProRender, and I reckon it took probably around 11 minutes on my machine, which is a MacBook Pro 2015 with an Intel 2-core, 4-thread, 2.7 gigahertz processor. So not the most beastly of computers, and it only uses one thread anyway, the MTL compiler servers. So there you go. But once it's done, you can do viewport rendering, you can do final rendering, and it's great. It's just as good, if not a little bit better performance-wise compared to purge-wrangler. Certainly, I didn't feel like it was any worse, so that was a good thing. Now, when it comes to actual performance comparisons, I did actually go back and rerun some benchmarks. So let's look at those. In the yellow, we've got Kryptonite, and in the green, we've got purge-wrangler, and you can see that Kryptonite is consistently performing better than purge-wrangler did. Now, there is a caveat on this graph. I actually did upgrade from ProRender 3.1 to ProRender 3.2. So I shot myself in the foot there for consistency. However, be that as it may, Kryptonite now is, with ProRender 3.2, the fastest configuration with the same hardware. So that's pretty good. Also, it dealt way better. Kryptonite dealt way better with me turning on activity monitor halfway through these tests, which is why there's that weird sort of hump about halfway through them. It was just way more consistent than purge-wrangler was. But again, that could be down to ProRender 3.1 to 3.2. The next test I did was with Davinci Resolve. So I was just opening old projects and scrubbing through them, making sure everything was working, and that obviously that the graphics card was accelerating the application, and that all seemed to work fine. It was displaying on the large monitor, which is actually directly plugged into the eGPU. Pretty sure I mentioned that earlier, but anyway. Then I had my first sort of little hiccup. I was scrubbing through some 4K and playing it and just seeing what FPS I was getting, and I was getting about half the FPS of the actual footage. This 4K footage here of me trying to fix my bike is 50 FPS actually when it was shot, so here I'm getting sort of half that. But then I closed the project down, kind of left the video editing for about a week, and then came back and opened it up, and all of a sudden everything was running at 50 frames per second. So I'm not exactly sure why this is, but ever since then I've never been able to reproduce this half frame rate issue. So it could have just been a similar thing to Blender. Maybe there was some kind of optimization or compilation running in the background that I couldn't see. It wasn't stopping things from happening. Maybe it was slowing stuff down. This is all just speculation on my part. However, don't need to worry now because everything seems to be running just fine. So that let me move on to doing some more interesting tests. The first of which was to fire up Blackmagic's raw speed test and just do another benchmark comparing purge-wrangler, which was on the left, with Kryptonite on the right. And you can see that I've gained about 3 frames per second on average for the 8K format, which was really cool. And again, just some more, I guess, concrete evidence that Kryptonite is actually just a teensy bit faster than purge-wrangler. And that trend continued. So I went and reran all of the benchmarks that I did for purge-wrangler with Davinci Resolve. So this is mainly transcoding or rendering. And particularly in the case of the Hank render to the ProRes format, that was 4 minutes for purge-wrangler down to 3 minutes for Kryptonite, which was quite convincing that, that's not just some randomness there. The other results could be maybe margin of error, but that one in particular kind of said, yeah, this looks, again, adding up all the other evidence, like Kryptonite is definitely quicker than purge-wrangler, which is pretty awesome. So the next thing I wanted to investigate was screen capture plus an app, because, here at CrowdRender, I do a lot of basically tutorials showing people how to do stuff, and it's really nice to be able to capture the whole screen of the application I'm running and mess with it, but also record it without dropping frames or it jerking or doing stuff like that. And previously in purge-wrangler, this just didn't seem to work really well at all. So here I've got some footage that I've captured, I've put it into Resolve, and I'm actually screen capture as I'm playing back in Resolve and just seeing how it works. Now, in this particular sort of clip that I've got running, there's not a huge amount going on. There is actually some grading on this clip, so I've modified it slightly, but it's playing back fine. It's playing back at full speed. It's really smooth. I mean, the footage was captured, I think, about sort of 60 frames per second, and that's being captured while Resolve is playing it back, and it's all perfectly captured here. There is an occasional study you'll see, but mainly that's due to the fact that this footage is being streamed off of a platter drive and it has to seek every so often. Unfortunately, my enthusiasm was kind of short-lived because I went back and opened the troublesome project that was having the spotty playback performance while screen capture was happening, and as you can tell by looking at it, kind of the same thing was happening, so it didn't look like Kryptonite had really helped with this. So it may just be that this particular project has a gremlin in it, or I'm just expecting too much of my particular setup, which does still depend a little bit on the CPU. Even though I checked that, screen capture is actually being accelerated by the GPU, that doesn't necessarily mean that the encoding is being accelerated by it. So I'm going to test a bit more and actually see if I can get to the bottom of it and figure out how to make this whole thing much, much smoother, because I'm pretty sure if I can do it, then you guys would benefit hugely from that as well. So stay tuned on that front. Next up was Affinity Photo. So I've recently acquired a copy of Affinity Photo and I've been using it a little bit. I'm kind of excited about the ability to do batch processing, particularly with noise removal, because sometimes I do time-lapse photography at night, and there's a hell of a lot of noise in those images, and I've actually done one run where I've successfully completed an entire batch job removing noise from a whole bunch of photographs, which is kind of cool, and I want to do this again with the eGPU. So this wasn't really much of an experiment to get excited about. All I was doing is going to the settings and making sure the eGPU is actually recognized, which means hopefully in a future video I can show you guys how to do a batch job with Affinity Photo, remove noise, but actually speed it up using an eGPU, because I think that would be really cool. So, you may want to subscribe just in case that does come up. The next thing I wanted to do was play some games, and I'm going to use Inside again, like I did in the last video. 1 for comparison, and 2 just because I'm lazy, and 3 because Mac doesn't really have many games for it anyway, so may as well just stick to the one that I've already used. And the upshot of this was the game still runs at 60 FPS, still runs on the big monitor at 1080p, and it's still fairly playable, bearing in mind that if you look at this kid real close up, he's practically based on like the Mii character from the Nintendo Wii. He's not got a lot of poly on him. So I'm guessing that graphically this game isn't probably the most taxing, even though it's got some really, really well done effects, like the shading, the lighting, and everything works really well. As far as performance is concerned, literally, I cannot tell. Purge-wrangler to Kryptonite, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference. So there's certainly no degradation, like it was by no means the imagination any worse or even any different as far as I could tell. So you're covered if you're worried about gaming on Mac, which I'm pretty sure you're not, but I'm covering it anyway. Rest assured, it's going to work just fine. Moving on then, next thing. So this was the final batch of tests I wanted to run with OBS, because I like using OBS, but I've never really been able to get it to work really well on this MacBook. So with a beefy new eGPU and Kryptonite, I thought I'd give it another shot. So I tested it with Resolve, Blender, and Inside. First with recording and then trying to stream. So first up was Resolve, and this was a big fail, unfortunately. The playback in the timeline was really, really bad. And I think one of the potential reasons for this is OBS has to use the hardware encoding in the Intel chip in the MacBook. It can't use the eGPU for whatever reason, I'm not sure. Hey, if you can make that work, comment down below. I would love to be able to get that to happen. And at the same time, Davinci Resolve's also trying to use the Intel chip for playback as well. And I think they fight, and that causes this bad performance. Interestingly enough, Blender didn't seem to have any of the same kind of performance issues. So the viewport was very smooth. Playback was probably around sort of 60 frames a second. Don't know, I wasn't actually measuring it, but yeah, it just was really easy to use. And okay, yeah, I'm using the default cube here, which is probably not the most drastic of tests to put Blender through. So I opened up a file from James Redmond. This is a demo file, be a link in the description below to it. And it has a lot more poly in it, and it's got geometry nodes, so yeah, that's nice. And there's a little animation as well, and all of that seemed to go much, much better than using Resolve. And I think this is because Blender's mostly using the GPU, while OBS is mostly using the CPU, so they're not fighting as much. So yeah, theory. Maybe some more testing will see if that's actually real or not, or just me speculating. As for Inside, look, Inside was okay, but you can tell by watching this playback it's not perfect. I think there's definitely some dropping of frames or skipping ahead because it's trying to catch up. You can kind of see it sort of pausing and then moving again every so often. Now compare that to this clip, which was captured using QuickTime, which is really smooth and makes me think, okay, maybe I was wrong. Maybe encoding in QuickTime is actually done on the eGPU after all. So yeah. And going back to the OBS capture again, you can see there's a big difference. So I guess the key takeaway here is if you want smoothness, then probably use QuickTime for capture. So the final test I wanted to do was to stream something to YouTube. I've tried several times streaming Blender and other applications, and every time it's just failed the MacBook, proving that it's just not up to the task of running OBS, with frames dropping and audiences complaining that the stream cuts out halfway through. So I fired up OBS and Inside and tried to do another stream and downloaded the recording, and that's what you're watching now. So I'm offering this up for your consideration. If you're keen to get into streaming, or you're streaming currently and wondering if you could use a MacBook, if you add an eGPU and Kryptonite and OBS, then you can. And basically this is the result. So you can decide for yourself if you think this would be something you'd want to bother with. For me personally, it's a massive step forward from where I was. I wasn't able to really stream at all, and this one looks half decent. Sure, the frame rate is not exactly 60 frames a second, there's a couple of skips and jumps in there, but compared to what I was having to deal with, this would at least make it workable. So I'm pretty impressed with where I've been able to get to, and maybe with a few more tweaks and getting a little bit more familiar with OBS and the settings, I could get it to maybe be even a little bit better. Certainly, I think it's a massive improvement, as I've already said, so pretty cool stuff. But what about Blender? I mean, games is nice, but obviously I'm actually mostly involved with Blender. I don't really play games that much. So during the same stream, I did start up Blender and gave that a go. And to be honest, it was actually pretty good. I was able to pretty much read back to myself all of the buttons and the text on them. So I think I'd be able to follow along if I was, watching my own tutorial on a stream. And the playback of the animation, although a little bit slower, it wasn't terrible. You could at least get the idea of what was going on, which I think is the important thing for streaming. You need to be able to at least follow along and be able to tell what's happening, and ultimately be able to reproduce the result yourself later on. So this showed to me that, yeah, actually now I can stream. Now, there is a caveat. There was actually one warning from YouTube telling me that the stream was at a bitrate that was lower than it liked. However, the recording, I guess, is the ultimate proof, because I never really saw any sort of dropping of the stream in the recording or any other problems. And honestly, the bitrate it was complaining about, although low, it wasn't fatal. I think it dropped to like 1.5 megabits per second, but OBS was reporting roughly 4 megabits a second the whole time. So I think, in conclusion, streaming while running Blender or while running other apps seems to be viable. Again, probably not Davinci Resolve, but I'm hoping with a little bit of tweaking I might be able to get that fixed. And hopefully there'll be another video about that as well, because I am planning to come back and do a little bit more Davinci Resolve content, because I've just managed to get some help from someone at Blackmagic Design in getting Davinci Resolve optimized. So there's a little sort of tempting morsel there for you to come back and watch the next video. And that's it. That's all the tests done. So I just want to sum up and let you know what I think about Kryptonite generally. So as the successor to purge-wrangler, if you had to choose between the two, no brainer, I would definitely choose Kryptonite, on the grounds that it is more secure because you don't have to turn off all the security features of your Mac. Also, the installation doesn't actually change your operating system on disk. And the fact that, with the exception of Blender and the finicky thing with the MTL compiler service, every application that we've tested has ended up proving to be slightly faster, in some cases significantly faster, but there's been a performance benefit to doing this. So highly recommend it. Maybe it's a little bit more finicky to install, but the result you get is better. And for sure, let us know what you think in the comments below, and if there's anything you want us to do in the future, yeah, drop it there. But before I nick off and get out of here, I just want to say a huge thanks to M-Wave Australia, who have been really helpful in supplying us with the equipment that we use to make these videos. So there'll be a link to their store in the description below, where you can pick up a Razer Core X or any of these other bits of hardware, because we've been using this stuff as well in a PC that we built. So stay tuned, because we'll do some more content with that as well. And it's just been awesome, so huge thanks to them. And that's it. That's the end of the video. Thanks so much for watching. Would really appreciate, the like, subscribe, share, etc., bell notification, bell smashing, whatever we want to call it. And for sure, we will see you in the next video, where we look into some more tantalizingly technical things, which will dazzle and delight, I'm sure. So catch you then. Ciao.